Welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast, your home for deer hunting news, stories, and strategies. And now, your host, Mark Kenyon.
Welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast. I'm your host, Mark Kenyon, and this is episode number 6. Today, we're going to be talking about planning and executing DIY bow hunting trips for whitetails. And joining us is Bernie Barringer, author of the Freelance Bowhunter. Stick around, because this is going to be good. All right, hey there, folks. I am really excited today for this podcast because joining me and our co-host Dan Johnson is Bernie Barringer, an accomplished outdoor writer and the author of the excellent new book, The Freelance Bowhunter. Welcome to the show, Bernie.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. We're really excited to have you here. And how's your afternoon been so far?
It's been pretty good. Trying to get some deadlines taken care of and get some magazine articles out, and it's a good day to do that because it's pouring rain here in Minnesota.
I feel your pain. That's actually the same thing I'm doing. I've got a deadline looming tomorrow that I'm racing towards. So good stuff. With that said, then, before we dive too far into things, I was hoping that you could give the listeners a brief introduction to who you are, what you do, and what your new book is all about.
Sure, I'd be happy to. I've been a bow hunter for many, many years. I actually started bow hunting in 1973 when I was 14 years old, and primarily because my folks wouldn't let me own a gun. And I'm not sure if that was more about the gun or about me, actually. But I came from a non-hunting family, and a neighbor of mine was a bow hunter, and there was very few bow hunters at that time, back in the 70s. And I bought a recurve bear bow from a guy that sold bear archery equipment out of his garage, and started bow hunting and just absolutely got hooked on it. And I was a commercial fur trapper through the 80s, and then when the fur markets kind of fell apart, I went back to college, got a degree in journalism, and really took the bow hunting more seriously. And that's when I started traveling. I lived in northern Iowa at the time, which was kind of the wrong part of Iowa for the really big bucks. And so I started going to southern and southeastern Iowa, and then eventually ended up moving up to northern Minnesota, and I've continued to travel and I've been able to bow hunt in quite a few different states. And I like the challenge of trying to do it on my own. I almost never go with outfitters, actually. I'm primarily a do-it-yourself hunter, and I primarily hunt public land, although there's been times when I've been able to get permission on some private land and so forth. But just pretty well hooked on the traveling to bow hunt, and I've been somewhat successful. It's taken me a while to really learn some of the tricks and the things that make it a little easier. So that was the purpose of the book, is to try to pass some of the information along to other people who might have the same interest. And, in the last 15 years or so, the Outdoor Channel, Sportsman's Channel, these TV shows have really generated a lot of interest in people going to other areas to hunt. There's a lot of people in Pennsylvania or North Carolina or Michigan or some of the states that typically don't produce as much quality bigger bucks, and those people see the TV and they go, man, I'd like to shoot a buck like that,
Right.
And so there's kind of a niche that I felt there was enough people out there to actually produce a book, and I've been really surprised. The book has done very well, and I'm not to the break-even point yet, but it looks like it'll happen at least.
That's great. Well, I'm one of those Michigan guys that wanted to look for greener pastures, so I've been doing just that, just like you said. I've been traveling to other states and have hunted now, I think, 5 or 6 different states, and I feel like I'm relatively experienced in this kind of DIY whitetail trip. But even with that experience, after reading your book, I still thought I took a lot from it and learned some great new ideas. So I've really found it valuable.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. That's really exciting to me that people, I'm getting a lot of good feedback like that too, and that's exciting. And more than making money on the book, I really like to help people be more successful. That's real gratifying.
Yeah, absolutely. That said, then, maybe diving into the real topic here, then, as your book begins, you ask the question of whether or not a DIY bow hunting trip is for you, for the listener. So can you explain to us, for one of our listeners, how can they better understand if this kind of trip is a good fit for them?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It really isn't for everybody because it's very hard work, first of all, and you've got to really be a learner. You've got to be a person who enjoys learning about the deer and seeing new areas and trying new things. And some people would be perfectly happy to go to Iowa, say, and hire an outfitter and have them do all the work, and you just get in the stand and hope a nice buck goes by. But for me, that's not nearly as gratifying as finding a place and really learning it and figuring it out and putting the stand in the right tree and shooting that deer. And I should also say that the TV shows have created kind of an environment where people have unrealistic expectations a lot of times, where they go, they really think that you can go to parts of Iowa and there's literally every property has 150 or 160 class buck on it. And that's not necessarily true. Those bucks are certainly out there. There's 180 inch. If you spend 10 days in Iowa in a really good spot, you got a really good chance to see a Boone and Crockett buck. But getting that buck is a completely different story, and particularly on public land where they get a lot of pressure. So, I think a guy has to ask himself, what are my expectations? What do I want to do? Am I really willing to put in the work and do it myself and get the extra satisfaction out of it? Or would I rather have, somebody else do the work and I could just go there and have a chance to shoot the deer? Yeah,
I think I'm a lot like you in that I get so much more satisfaction out of actually putting in the work, to achieve a goal. There's a story I always tell about. There's a mountain in New Hampshire that I climbed, and I didn't tell my wife that there's actually a road that goes to the top of the mountain too. So we got all the way to the top, and then she saw a parking lot. She said, well, why the heck did we climb up it if there was a road? And, to me, the summit and that view from the top wouldn't mean nearly as much, and it wouldn't be as beautiful if I hadn't actually sweated and worked my way all the way to the top. And I think that's kind of how I look at deer hunting too.
Yeah, I get that. I definitely understand that.
Yeah. So speaking though of, again, if this is the right fit for someone, can somebody on a limited budget and with limited vacation time, pull off a trip like this? I think a lot of people assume that you need a lot of money to go out of state and to, chase these big bucks. But is that true?
Well, it's really not true. And I think that's the key to what has made this book so successful so far, is that, this is about doing it on a budget. I either stay in a travel trailer or motel, or I've camped a few times, and I've learned to eat on a budget, and I cover a lot of really cool tactics to save money in the book, and even for me, I've shot quite a few nice bucks over the years, but I haven't mounted very many, and the reason for that is I'd rather take the money that it costs to mount it and go on another hunt. And so, I mean, as a writer, I'm not flush with cash, and I have to really watch the budget. And so I've learned to save money and do things in a way that allows me to do more of it.
Yeah, that makes all the sense in the world. That I'm in a similar boat too. So how many trips like this are you taking a year? It's usually one or sometimes two trip, but each trip may be more than one state. For example, I will be hunting Kentucky and Kansas this year in addition to my home state, and always have a backup because I've got some good areas I've hunted in Missouri before, and Missouri's an over-the-counter state where you can just go up and arrive and draw and just go buy a tag. Right. Where you have to apply for a tag in Kansas, for example. So, if I happen to tag out fairly quickly in Kansas, then I can just hit Missouri on my way home and spend a few days in some areas that I've already scouted out in Missouri. So I'll say usually I'll take one or two trips a year, but sometimes it'll be as many as 4 states. Wow. Busy fall. So this kind of just popped in my head, but I know you mentioned you lived in Iowa for a period of time, and I've got some friends, including Dan, our co-host, who lives in Iowa as well. Do you think there's any, for a guy that already lives in a top whitetail state, is it worth doing one of these out-of-state trips just for the sake of it? Or, what's your opinion on that? Were you going out of state when you lived in Iowa, or did you focus on, right at home where you knew there were some good deer?
Well, I did make one out-of-state trip when I lived in Iowa. I primarily hunted throughout the state, though. I would go to areas that I felt were better areas than where I lived. And I live in the north central part of the state. I was kind of born and raised there, and it's real open, flat farm country. And with the shotgun season, the deer just don't have a place to hide. And the soils are perfect. Everything is perfect for growing big bucks. The genetics are there. It's just that they got shot down so hard that the potential to shoot a bigger buck is in other parts of the state, northeast and southeast and south central. And so that's what I was doing when I lived in Iowa. And then I was involved in tournament fishing, which brought me to Minnesota. And so after I moved to Minnesota, I got a lot more. And I always said that for a fisherman, it's a great place to live. But for a deer hunter, it's like dying and going to hell. And this part of Minnesota, 80% of the deer, 80% of the bucks are shot when they're a year and a half old in this part of the state.
Yikes.
There's pockets of good whitetail hunting in Minnesota, don't get me wrong, but overall the state is not one of the top states. So I would say if you live in a great state, you can add another state, and have an opportunity to go shoot another buck in another state. Even if you're in a terrific location, there's no point in feeling like you're limited to one state, even if you're in one of the best states.
Yeah. So for you, Dan, since you live in Iowa, have you ever thought about this? Have you ever considered going out of state, or I don't know, have you before?
I have not hunted whitetails out of state because I don't want to sound arrogant, but I have good whitetail property. So and I don't own it or lease it. I just have permission to hunt a really, really good piece of Iowa property. Now, if I was to go out of state to hunt a different whitetail state, I'd probably go somewhere like Kansas, where the terrain is different. My uncle lives down there, so I'd already have kind of an in, and just a different type of hunting. It's not your Iowa ag fields and draws and rolling timbers, as opposed to a flatter land where you're hunting like creek systems, river systems, and fence rows, basically.
Yeah, that makes sense. So that brings up another good question then. You mentioned one of the things you'd be looking for was a different experience. But Bernie, when you're looking at a state to potentially hunt, what's the most important thing you're looking for, and what are a couple of factors that you're taking a look at when deciding what your out-of-state destination should be?
Well, a different experience certainly is one of them. I just had a ball hunting in Montana, in southeastern Montana. And I never dreamed that I'd climb in a tree stand when it was 100 degrees. But, I mean, literally, I just had so much fun because I saw so many deer, and I killed a beautiful 10-pointer on the third day that I was out there on September 3. I think it was 2011 or 12.
Is that velvet still?
No, there was actually velvet deer with it, but this one had already rubbed its velvet off. Now, okay. I like hunting North Dakota because it's completely different out there where I hunt. That's a big part of it. I am kind of in love with the challenge of outwitting a mature deer. So that's another big part of it for me, is I want to go to places where I have a chance to shoot a nice deer. And that doesn't necessarily mean it has the biggest rack. In my book, there's a picture of a 6-year-old buck that won't even make Pope and Young minimums, but I shot that buck on public land. And to me, that's really gratifying because, it's a real challenge to shoot a mature buck on public land. And so the fact that thing was an 150-inch buck didn't mean that much to me. It was a older, mature, big body buck with a thick chest, and that was a really fun hunt for me, and I was really happy with that deer.
No, I bet. I can definitely relate to that. I killed kind of a similar deal. Killed a 5.5-year-old this past year that wouldn't score well at all and wasn't the biggest rack in the world, but the amount of work that went into it, it just, again, like we talked about earlier, that work, it kind of manifests itself in how much you enjoy the hunt and the memories afterwards too.
Well, another important part of this too is that I'm doing this not to please a TV audience or anything. I'm basically doing this for myself. So if a guy would shoot that buck on TV, the viewers would go, man, why did he shoot that deer? But I don't care about that. I'm out there because I'm out there to enjoy the challenge, and that deer was a perfect deer for that situation. That was the 12th day of a 7-day hunt. You know what I mean? I was expecting to leave after 7 days, and I was still there after 12 days. So
the trophy is in the eye of the beholder, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, so true. Now, in your book, Bernie, you mentioned a pretty detailed kind of research process that you go through when looking to find these different states and properties. And a lot of the same things you've done, I do as well. But for the listeners out there, could you maybe break down a handful of the different steps that go into you choosing your state and then the area and property? I think that'd be really interesting.
Yeah, I think that's probably the part that people seem to like the most about the book is the process that I explain how to go through to, you're starting wide. You haven't even decided what state you're going to go through, and you're getting down, and you're working it down from that broad approach all the way down to the exact tree you're going to hang your stand into in some state somewhere on a piece of property. Well, how do you get from point A to point B is a pretty important process, and I really think that the key to it is being able to do the research. And when I first started doing this, there was absolutely nothing compared to what there is today as far as research tools. Your website, my website, bowhuntingroad.com, has a lot of resources. This book has 60 pages of information about which states are the good states and what parts of the states produce the biggest bucks and
I love that.
And so forth. Yeah, and there's so much information out there. You can get on Google Earth. I've killed deer in places that I found on Google Earth. Yeah. And so, if you start wide and you decide, okay, how much does a tag cost? How do I get a tag? The over-the-counter states, and then I go through this process in pretty good detail in the book. And, if you want to hunt Iowa, it's going to take you at least 3 years to draw a tag. You're going to have to have at least 2 preference points and possibly 3 in some of the zones. So you're not just going to go to Iowa this fall. You could go to Missouri or North Dakota or Kentucky or some of these good quality states that have over-the-counter tags. So you got to decide which state you're going to go to first, and then you're going to look at what public land is available in the state, how much pressure it gets, and then once you've decided which piece of property you're going to go to, then you're actually looking for the spots, and you can do a lot of that online too. Like I said, with Google Earth, you can see potential deer travel corridors. The forums today, you can go on there and it's amazing. I've put stuff on a forum and said, hey, I'm going to this part of the state. Does anybody hunt there? Can I get a piece of advice? And I mean, I had a guy actually that offered to drive me around and show me some spots.
Wow.
And so, the forums are a great place to mine information. So a lot of that can be done before you ever leave home. And then, of course, once you're on the property, then that's the real key to finding the right spot. And you're going to hunt differently than you would if you owned a piece of property or had permission on a piece of property. I call it hunting aggressively, and that's a really important key to what makes this all work. Because if you had, say, a couple 100 acres of ground that you hunt, you'd probably have a couple bedding areas there that you would never go into. You might have a sanctuary that you really avoid at all costs, and you would know where the deer tend to feed and where they tend to travel and where the food sources are. But if you go to a new piece of property, you got to start from scratch, and you're going to walk right through those bedding areas and bust the deer out. And you hate doing it, but it's part of how you have to do it because you need to know where they are. Yeah. And, you can learn the travel corridors by looking at trails and following tracks and looking at scrapes and rubs. And, you really have to get out on the ground and learn the property. The temptation is when you first get there is to just, here's a good looking spot, put up a tree stand and get in it. But that's not necessarily the best way to hunt because you don't have the confidence that it takes. If you're on a rut hunt, you might want to sit in a stand all day. You want to have confidence that you're in the right spot before you ever get in there because you're going to be second guessing yourself all the time if you don't. And so you got to know what's over the next hill, and that way you have confidence when you do get in the stand that you're in the right spot. So those are all pretty important keys to it. And, first day I arrive at a new property, I rarely hunt the first day. I'm usually maybe glassing the property from the roads with a spotting scope, trying to figure out where the deer activity is. And the first stand that I put up is likely to be what I call an observation stand, where I'm actually putting a stand up in a place where I can have a good view of a large field or open timber or something like that, and try to get a better feel for what the movement looks like. And then throughout the week, then I'll narrow it down. And by the time I, have 3 or 4 days under my belt, I'm usually pushing all my chips into one spot. I'm cashing in. I'm going all in on one tree where this is the place I think it's going to happen,
And
I'm sorry. With that said, how many times do you visit a property before, like, the season actually starts or before your trip? I know time and distance have a lot to do with that, but do you do a lot of scouting on those properties physically before you do a hunt?
Typically, I don't very much because they're usually too far away. I try to, if I can, if I'm in an area, like, for example, I told you I'm going to Kentucky this fall. Well, I was at the archery trade show in Kentucky, or in Nashville in January, and I drove through some of the area that I'll be hunting this fall on my way back, just to look it over good and kind of see what the lay of the land looks like. So there's occasion when I can do that, but more likely I tend to go back to some of the spots that I found that are really good. And I killed just a terrific buck in Kansas last fall, and it was a spot that I found the year before. Didn't get one, but I went back last fall and fine-tuned my positioning a little bit and so forth, and I shot a great, really nice 145 Class 8-pointer. Well, that's the kind of a spot where I think a guy could go back, and each year, if the wind was right, you'd have a pretty good chance to shoot a decent buck on that spot every year. And that's another thing a person has to ask himself: are you interested in keeping going back to the same spot, or do you want to keep trying new areas? And
right. That's
a real trade-off for me. I like to see new. I got itchy feet, my wife says. She says that, I like to try new areas, but I also have a handful of spots that I go, I got to get back there. If it ain't this year, I got to go back there next year. And so, there's a combination. It's a trade-off. It's a lot of personal preference too on what you like.
More for the adventure.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So speaking of your hunting strategy, Bernie, that was one of the things I was hoping to dive into it. As I saw in the book, and as you mentioned, you usually start your hunts with the observation stand, start learning things, and then narrow down your stand options. How do you use trail cameras throughout that process?
Boy, the trail cameras are a really important component to the process. There's two reasons I like to use a lot of trail cameras. Number one, because I want to know what the potential of the area is as soon as possible. I want to inventory the bucks, I guess is the best way to put it, where, if I've been on hunts where I had a 125 or 130 inch buck walk by the first time I sat in the stand, and I pass them up. Then I was there for a week, and that turned out to be the biggest buck I saw. So the sooner you can get a handle on what the potential of the area is, the better off you are. And there's no better way to do that than with trail cameras. And in particular, I hang them both on trails and on scrapes. And scrapes, anytime after about the last week in October, third to last week in October, if you start putting trail cameras on scrapes and then use some good fresh urine or some deer lure in those scrapes, you'll inventory the majority of the bucks. Within 3-4 days, you'll have the majority of the bucks on camera. So you have a lot better you have a lot better idea of what the potential is and what you should hold out for. And so that's the first aspect. The second aspect is it will tell you what stage of the rut these deer are in based on how they're reacting, and you can look at them and see how how heavily they're working the scrapes, and are their tarsal glands stained up like they've been rutting pretty hard? Are the does in the scrapes or just the bucks? Those will give you clues as to what the status of the rut is, and that'll help you make decisions on stand placement. Are these bucks on the cruise, or are they starting to get in a lockdown stage where they're actually coupled up with does and aren't traveling as much? Then you need to be focusing more on the bedding areas and so forth. So, yeah, trail cameras, I'm I literally have 4 to 6 trail cameras out almost all the time when I'm hunting.
Wow. Yeah, that was exactly what I was going to ask, was how many cameras you've got out there. Do you use any of the new cameras that are transmitting, photos right to your phone or to your computer at all, or are you still visiting those cameras to physically check on the SD card?
I'm physically checking them, and I get in and out as quick as I can with these cameras. And I also use like the scent killer sprays on my pant legs as I'm moving through the forest to try to reduce my scent as much as possible. Doing it the way that I do it in this aggressive style hunting, you can't completely eliminate your impact on the area, but you can reduce it by moving quickly and reducing your scent. And I don't check cameras until I need to. I'd like to let them sit for 2 or 3 days if possible. But there are times you just have to go find out what's there because you need to know where you're going to hunt that night.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Dan, do you have any other questions on the top of your head after hearing a couple of these things?
Well, I mean, I got a ton of questions because that's just the type of person. First things first, though. You're from Forest City, right?
Yep.
Yep. I graduated from Waldorf College.
I'll be darned.
Yep. Small world. Now, back to whitetails. I think I read somewhere where you said you've been somewhere north of 20 do-it-yourself hunts. Is that correct?
Yeah, about that.
What's your success rate on these hunts?
My success rate is probably just under 50%.
Okay.
I would say I haven't actually counted them up, but I would say between 1 out of 2 to 1 out of 3 is and I'm fairly selective. I'm not holding out for a really big buck in every hunt, but I'm fairly selective, and I will I'll go home with the tag in my pocket rather than shoot a buck that doesn't satisfy me. So but realistically, going back to the unrealistic expectations that people sometimes have when they start out doing this, if you can get a buck one or two 50% or 30% of the time on these hunts, you're doing pretty good. That's the reality of it.
Oh yeah. No, I've seen the same thing. These hunts aren't easy. And I think, like you said, people need to go into it with that type of expectation that part of what you're going into is the experience. And it's going to be a challenge, but it's very rewarding when it does come together. And even when things don't come together, I think, at least personally, I learn so much from these kinds of hunts. And it's just such a fun challenge to try to put myself up against that it's worth going into it knowing that it could be pretty difficult.
Right.
Now, one other thing, or a couple other things that I thought were pretty interesting, taking a step back away from the actual hunt, is a few of the logistics that you talk about in the book. Specifically, you had some interesting ideas about kind of housing, so where you stay during the hunt, and then how you're eating. Could you share with us a little bit about your philosophy on how you handle those two topics?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I do some of these seminars, and I think that's probably the number one question that people ask. And there's a lot of different options for lodging. One of them is like Dan mentioned, where if you know somebody and have a bed to sleep in, that's terrific because you're saving a lot of money and you have a base of operation already in place. I've stayed in a lot of motel rooms. When I can, I pull a travel trailer. I love it. I love the travel trailer because it works perfect. I got everything there. I just get up in the morning, make myself a couple pieces of toast, fry an egg or something like that, and go hunting. And it's surprising how many of these states allow you to camp in a travel trailer or a tent on the public hunting area or in the parking lots of the public hunting area.
Nice.
I've camped in Missouri and North Dakota and some of these places where there's no charge. You just pull up and camp. And every few days you got to go, get more water or LP gas or drain your sewer or whatever. But reality is that's my preferred way to do it. I've also camped in a tent, which has been okay, but it's hard to find a good shower at times. And a couple times I have been able to camp or stay in a cabin. In Kansas a couple of years ago, I actually rented a cabin from a Bible camp that was closed for the winter, and they just had a few cabins that they kept the heat on in, and they rented them out for $60 a night. And that was really nice because it had a kitchenette in it and everything. That was, for $60 a night, it's not bad at all. So that worked out good. There's a lot of different options for lodging. And one thing that I like to do is trade hunts also. These aren't always public land hunts, but, I have really good bear hunting where I live here in Minnesota, and I'll go out and I'll seek out people that have quality whitetail hunting somewhere that are willing to trade me a hunt. I'll offer them a bear hunt in exchange for a whitetail hunt, and then I have a place to stay and some help in that way. So, there's a lot of options for lodging. As far as the food goes, I like, people say I live to eat, not eat to live. So I like a hot meal at the end of the day, and it keeps my spirit up. And so I use a lot of crock pot meals for slow cookers, and I'll take and put the meals together before I leave home, and just take like a Tupperware, and I'll throw everything in there, like a piece of roast and some onion and potatoes and everything that goes in there with it, and throw it in the freezer. And then when I get up in the morning, I'll plug in the crock pot and turn it on and just drop that frozen hunk in the crock pot. And when I get home, after getting out of the tree stand at dark, then the room smells delicious, and I got a hot meal waiting for me. So I use that a lot.
That's awesome.
And yeah, I think that eating well really helps keep your spirit up and keep your drive going. You can wear down if the weather's nasty and stuff like that. After 4 or 5 days of hunting hard and nasty weather, you can lose your drive if you're not careful. But if you're going to go to a restaurant for 2 or 3 meals a day, it's going to run up a pretty big bill, and you can get pretty sick and tired of restaurant food too.
Yeah, that's the truth. I unfortunately have typically fallen into that crowd. I save the money on. I usually try to get the cheapest hotel I can get, and I'm usually staying at a pretty lousy place. But for some reason, then I splurge and I've been going out to eat every night. And when I was reading your book, I was like, geez, like there are a lot of better ways I could be doing this rather than eating McDonald's every night and killing myself. I could eat something nice from home and save a bunch of money on top of that. So that's a great idea.
Yeah.
Do you have any other, favorite snacks or anything during the day? I think, it sounds like you're doing much like what I do, hunting all day on these rut hunting trips. Is there anything in particular that you like to pack for that hunt during the day, or do you just grab whatever's handy, a granola bar, or candy bar, or something?
Yeah, pretty much. I'm just basically eating snacks during the course of the day. A granola bar, some trail mix, maybe an apple or something like that in the backpack. That I tend to choose things that I can eat easily without a lot of movement or noise. I don't like crackly wrappers and stuff like that. If it's really still out, I don't. I want to be real careful. And interestingly, a lot of people it seems like a buck likes to show up when you're eating. So it's a good idea to kind of have a plan of where you're going to ditch something that's in your hand, whether that's your phone or a book or a granola bar. It's always a good idea to know if the deer shows up, how can you get rid of it in a hurry and get your bow in your hand. So I always try to have a plan of what I'm going to do.
Do you ever practice shooting your bow with like a sandwich in your mouth or an apple in your mouth?
No, I haven't, but
might be something worth trying.
Yeah, I suppose. I use a kisser button, so that might be a little awkward.
Oh, that's great. Dan, did you have any other questions that were popping up in your head?
Just as far as, you mentioned different classes of animal that you kind of go after. Now, as a hunt progresses and you've been there for like a 4-day and you're moving on to your 5th, 6th, 7th, do your standards stay true to like day one, or do you let your standards go as the hunt or the trip progresses?
I think your standards evolve based on the information you're gathering. For me, it does. I pretty much have a minimum of what I'm willing to take, and it also has to do with where I'm at in the hunt and how I'm going to take care of that deer. On some of my hunts, I have to just throw the deer in the truck and go home, and so that's a component to it too. If I'm going to another state, then I want to make sure if I got to take care of a deer, it's going to be one that's worth taking care of, So that's another part of it. And we've all heard this statement that you should never pass up on the first day what you'd shoot on the last day. And I don't really agree with that because, your information does evolve through the course of the hunt. And, here's a good example, and I tell this story in the book, and it just happened last fall where I drew an Iowa tag, and it takes 3 years to draw this Iowa tag, and man, I had some really big bucks on trail camera. And I'd been in Iowa for 2 days, and my wife calls, and she told me that her mother died. So here I'm in a situation. What do? Do I go home? And fortunately, I have an amazing wife who said, you better stay and hunt. I know how long it took you to draw this tag, and I don't want you to just come home for me. And so this was like on a Tuesday or Wednesday, and the funeral's on a Saturday. So suddenly my perception of what I was willing to take changed, because I was planning to go to Kansas after that. And on Friday morning, about a 125 class buck comes in and presents me a perfect shot. And I just fell in love with the timing. Normally I wouldn't have shot that buck at that point in the hunt, but then at that point I could shoot that buck and put it in the truck and go to the funeral, which is halfway between home and where I was then. That's what I did is I quartered the buck and put it in coolers. I gave it to my wife, who took it home after the funeral, and then I went on to Kansas. So that's a case where everything changed with one phone call.
Your wife sounds awesome, by the way.
She is. She's absolutely crazy, or she would never put up with a guy like me for 35 years.
I think behind every good hunter is an amazing wife. I think that's pretty safe to say for most of us. So you brought up a topic that I wanted to touch on, Bernie, and that was how you handle your deer after you're successful, after you kill one. In my situation, sometimes I've been with a partner where one of us is hunting, and if one of us kills one, the other will still stick around and help, film the hunt or something like that, because we're typically filming our hunts. So in those cases, we've brought our deer to a local processor and had them, process the deer, freeze it, and then when both of us are done hunting, then we'll come back, grab that, and head home. But in your case, what are you typically doing, and what are some of the options that a guy can look at?
I have done that before, and that works great. It depends on, I like to butcher my own deer, so if I'm done and I shoot a deer and I'm ready to go home, I'll just take it home and do it at home. I try to take a deep freeze with me whenever I can, especially if I'm going to more than one state at a time. And I have a small chest freezer that I can get in the back of my truck, or it fits in the front of my trailer. And I butchered deer right there in my trailer and just wrapped it and froze it right there. And
wow.
That's another option too. So I like venison. Our family eats a lot of venison, and so if I have a doe tag, and I have a way to take care of that doe, if it won't impact my ability to get a buck, I'm going to shoot a doe and go ahead and get it butchered and frozen too. I've taken that chest freezer in the back of the pickup. I've taken it in my camping trailer. I got a buddy that has a utility trailer, and he usually likes to bring a four-wheeler along when he goes with me, and we throw the deep freeze in there. So there's a lot of different options. I've flown on a couple of hunts, and in that case, I had to give the deer away. I didn't like that very much.
Yeah, no, I don't think I would either, but sometimes you got to do what you got to do. So that said, then, I wanted to switch now to a couple questions that we had submitted by some of our readers. And one reader, Dana Dutoy, had asked, how do you approach landowners when in the situations where you're asking for permission, given the fact that you're an out-of-state hunter? Do you ever have a negative reaction given the fact that you're out of state, or do you just leave that out completely? How do you handle that situation?
I think and I actually dedicate part of the book into what I call the lost art of getting permission. And it's more difficult if you're out of state, but it really helps if you just take a minute to kind of get to know the people and so forth. A lot of times people they're in their full camouflage and maybe even face paint, and they got mud all over their truck, and they drive up and ask the guy, can I hunt your land? And, the reaction is probably going to be pretty negative if you do that. But, he's going to look at your truck and go, is this guy going to tear up my fields? And, he looks kind of scary. So I think it helps to change your clothes and clean up and just go tell the guy and tell him a little bit of, tell them a little bit about yourself and that you're in the area and you're hunting and you'd like to have an opportunity to hunt his property, and before he has a chance to say no, just say, I'm real conscientious. I make sure I close the gates and I don't drive on the fields when they're wet, and just become a salesman, I guess. And there's always going to be some negative. There's guys that have had bad experiences, but I would say overall, the fact that you're from a different state isn't as much of a negative as you might think up front. I think your appearance and your demeanor and your credibility probably trumps your home.
Yeah, well, that's great. I always like to say, I think asking for permission on someone else's property to hunt is always kind of it's nerve-wracking. It's a little intimidating. So I would, just for the listeners out there, if you've never done that, I would just encourage you to give it a shot, to not be too worried about that, because right now, before asking somebody for permission, the answer is already no. So when you go up there and knock on the door, the worst thing that can happen is that the answer stays the same. So it's worth a shot, and it can really pay off. At least in my experience, getting that private property access can really help. One other question from a reader here, Jake Huff, had asked, which state, Bernie, do you think is the most overlooked when it comes to DIY whitetail hunts? Is there a sleeper state out there that you think tops the ranks?
Oh boy, do I have to just give you one?
You can cheat and give us two or three if you want to.
Yeah, I would say I'm going to give you three of them, okay? And I'll give you in the order that I think they are. I think North Dakota is probably the number one because it has so much public land and so little hunting pressure. I mean, the population of Chicago is like 4 times the population of the entire state of North Dakota,
Jeez.
And everybody hunts in North Dakota, but they all have their own land, and there's huge amounts of public land out there, and I've hunted, several 100-acre properties and been the only one bow hunting it, and the trophy potential is pretty good in North Dakota. So I would say that is one of my favorites. Eastern Colorado is one that very few people think about when they think about whitetails, but there are some really nice whitetails in Eastern Colorado. There's a lot of big ranches and farms where the people that own them, they don't value whitetails that much, and they're happy to let you hunt their land more likely than they are in Iowa or in Illinois, for example. It's fairly easy to get permission in the western states. In fact, Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana are all three like that, where a lot of these whitetails are patternable because they're eating in the alfalfa fields at night, and there's big herds of them out there. And the landowners are like, man, those things are eating all my alfalfa, so it's fairly easy to get permission. I like to spot and stalk deer once in a while. Colorado is perfect for that. It's a great place where you just go out and you see the deer bed down on this wide open plains of eastern Colorado and then sneak up on them. And then I would say another sleeper is Indiana. There's some really good quality deer hunting in Indiana. There's some fairly good sized properties that have public hunting, both state and Army Corps of Engineer properties around the reservoirs and so forth. And, there's 16 states in the book that I go into a lot of detail on the opportunities in them. And so there's others that I would kind of consider sleeper states too. Everybody knows about Wisconsin and Iowa and Illinois, and they're great. They're very good. Illinois and Wisconsin in particular have a lot of hunting pressure on their public lands, but they can consistently produce good quality deer. So they're not sleepers, but there's a lot of good hunting out there if a person really wants to go find it.
Yeah, that's so true. Well, it's funny, I took a look at your top 16 destination states, and I found that really interesting, especially because several weeks ago, I was actually putting together an article for North American Whitetail ranking the top 20 DIY states for whitetails. And so it was interesting to look at my list based on the research I had done and compare that to your set of destination states. And there was a lot, of course, that were the same. But something interesting, when I was creating this list, I was looking at a lot of the factors that we've talked about today, license cost, ease of acquisition, hunter density, public land, quantity and quality. But then we also looked at kind of a way of judging trophy potential, but on a per hunter basis. So we took a look at the number of Boone and Crockett entries per year and Pope and Young entries per year, and divided that by the number of hunters to really see what the real likelihood of per hunter, what the chances were at a Boone and Crockett or Pope and Young buck. And something pretty interesting I found was that actually Colorado, like you mentioned, had a significantly better chance of tagging a trophy buck than almost anywhere else. And because they have such a low number of whitetail hunters that, for that low number, they're actually getting some pretty nice deer. But then all the other states you mentioned too, they're right up there on the top of the list. There's, I think like you mentioned, when it comes right down to it, there's a lot of great options if you're just willing to, put in the work and go out there and give it a shot.
Yeah, and people also need to realize that when you look at the number of Pope and Young and Boone and Crockett bucks that are killed in some of these states, you have to compare that to the actual number overall deer harvest. You would, a deer, let's say a state like Iowa, and I'm just going to grab a number out of the air here because I don't know off the top of my head what the number is, that let's say Iowa kills one Boone and Crockett out of every 40,000 or 20,000 whitetails or something. That would seem like, you see Iowa has this many Boone and Crockett's and Wisconsin has this many Boone and Crockett's. Well, what you don't realize is Iowa's total harvest is, about 100,000 deer a year, where I think Wisconsin's total harvest is probably more like 700,000 deer a year, and Wisconsin's killing more Boone and Crockett whitetails, but when you look at the number per overall harvest, it's actually a lot lower in ratio than what Iowa is. So those are really important considerations to think about. Otherwise, you would just look at the state that kills the most big bucks and go there. But there's a lot of other factors in that too, and one of those is the amount of public land and the price of the tags, how hard it is to get a tag, and there's a lot of pressure on public land. There's places in Illinois where you actually have to drive in the parking lot in the morning and take a number and mark down on a chart where you're going to be hunting on this public land, and when it's full, nobody else can hunt there. I mean, that's what I call hunting pressure.
Ugh. That's nuts.
Yeah, that doesn't sound like fun to me at all. Well,
no.
I think this is a perfect place to wrap things up here as we're coming up on time. But is there anything else, Dan, that you would like to add?
Just real quick. Okay, so out of all your hunts, do you have a memory that sticks out that you'd like to share with us real quick?
Oh, boy. Yes, I do. And I'll tell you, and it's not as much whitetail related, but I'll try to be brief. This is a fascinating story. And my buddy Ron was with me in North Dakota, and we're hunting a piece of Army Corps of Engineer land along Lake Skakawea. And he's in a stand about 250 yards from me, and my phone rings at like 15 minutes before sunset, or before, halfway between sunset and dark, like 15 minutes before end of shooting light. And I'm thinking, why is he calling me now? Even if he shot a deer, wouldn't he text me? And I pick up the phone, and he goes, I just shot a mountain lion. I'm like, what?
Wow.
He said, I just shot a mountain lion. I was scared. It was like looking right up at me. And I'm like, you can't shoot a mountain lion. You don't have a mountain lion tag in North Dakota, And he says, well, I hope I missed it then. And I'm like, what are you? And he says, well, we got a picture of it on the trail camera. I'm like, are you serious? He said, this buck come running by. And so he grabbed his bow off the hanger. And he said, next thing you know, here comes this mountain lion. And it stops right at the base of his tree and looks up at him. And he panicked, like,
oh my
it
gosh,
scared the pudding out of him. And so anyway, when he shot, the mountain lion circled around behind his tree, and he didn't know what happened to it. And he says, you got to come and get me. And he's not going to get out of his tree. You know what I'm saying? And, but anyway, he eventually got down, and we did have a picture of the mountain lion. There was a buck at the scrape, and like 30 seconds to the next picture, the mountain lion was at the scrape. And, so that was a pretty fun aspect of that hunt.
That is crazy. So did he end up hitting that line?
He didn't hit the mountain lion. Thank goodness he missed it.
All right. All's well that ends well, right? Wow.
Yeah.
Well, that is a fascinating story. You're right. So Bernie, if our listeners want to check out your book or get more information from you or what you're doing, where should they go?
My website's the best place to get it. It's bowhuntingroad.com, like road trips, bowhuntingroad.com, and then click on the Buy Books tab there, and you can order a book right off of there. It's also on Amazon.com. There's a Kindle edition for it. Also, I prefer people buy it off my website because Amazon gouges you on the commission, but I'll take it anyway I can get it, I guess. I got a lot of money. I got a lot of books to sell before I break even here, but I think the book will be fascinating to people if they have any interest at all in going on a bow hunting road trip.
Yeah, definitely. And again, like I mentioned earlier, to everyone out there listening, I highly recommend it. It's The Freelance Bowhunter by Bernie Barringer. It's a great read. I've been on a lot of hunts like this before, and I still found a lot of interesting information, and it's also a fun read. So go out there, check it out. Definitely would recommend that. So, Bernie, thank you so much for your time today. This has been really interesting, and I'm sure everyone has really learned a lot, so thank you.
Great, I appreciate that.
So that said, thank you so much to everyone out there listening today. We're thrilled that you've taken time out of your day to join us. And if you've been enjoying the podcast so far, we'd like to ask you to take a quick second to leave a review or rating on iTunes. It means a lot to us. It takes just a quick minute, and it makes a big difference in helping new people find the podcast. So thank you in advance for that help. And finally, we'd also like to thank our partners who help make this show possible. So big thanks to Sitka Gear, Bushnell Optics, Trophy Ridge, Bear Archery, Redneck Blinds, Carbon Express Arrows, Lacrosse Boots, Big & J Long Range Attractants, and the Whitetail Institute of North America. Thank you. That said, be sure to visit wiredtohunt.com/episode 6, and that's the number 6, to view the show notes from today's episode. And if you haven't done so yet, please sign up for our Whitetail Fix newsletter as well, because that's where you're going to find news and updates from us coming straight to your inbox. So thank you again, Wired to Hunt Nation, and until next time, have a great week and stay wired to hunt.